He deceived his father and swindled his brother in order to gain the birthright. And yet, if you examine the scriptures carefully, the Jacob of Scripture, as opposed to the Jacob of preaching, is a righteous patriarch. He's the father of the 12 tribes, and he's the very personification, as the biblical text tells us, of truth. Now, that last characterization is perhaps to a large extent the result of the verse that we as Jews recite in our prayer services every day. The words are from the last verse of the last chapter of Micah's prophecy, chapter 7, verse 20, and it says, "You shall give truth to Jacob and loving kindness to Abraham." Truth to Jacob and loving kindness to Abraham. Repeated so often, for us as Jews, this verse has become a classic. And just as no one would, or in fact should, argue with Abraham's loving kindness, and by the way, the Hebrew term there is chesed, which is a term that almost defies translation and explanation. The Old English put it into loving kindness because they had no better way of trying to translate this wonderful word. Just as no one could or should argue with Abraham's loving kindness, so let me suggest Jacob's truth and truthfulness is also self-evident. And that's what I want to re-examine with you this evening. But the evidence in the portion that we're beginning to look at, chapter 25, toward the end of Genesis, at least on the surface, seems to point in a different direction. Abraham may well be a man of chesed, or loving kindness, or benevolence, or love and friendship, and everything else that goes into that. And after all, we are told traditionally that Abraham's tent had not only one opening, it had 4 openings. And it had 4 openings, so there'd be an opening to each direction, so they could accommodate travelers or visitors so much that he reach out to others. Abraham is truly a man of chesed, or benevolence, or loving kindness. But how can we describe Jacob as a man of truth after he had deceived his father? So what I want to do now is to look a little more carefully at the story. The story is really a story in 3 acts. Thank you so much. It's a story in 3 acts. There's the birth, there's the birthright, and then usually the last act we call the blessing. But as we examine it more carefully, you'll see it's the blessings, plural. So we start with the birth. The birth begins with the contract that God makes in Genesis chapter 25, verses 19 to 23. And central to that contract is, in fact, verse 23, which contains a promise. Now, you may remember the story. Rebecca had become pregnant after much prayer, and now something was going on inside her, a jostling that she didn't quite understand. And so she asked God about that. And God's response comes in verses 19 to 23. And then comes that wonderful promise. 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 people from within you will be separated. 1 people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger. Now, we read through that because we've read through that so many times that it goes right over our heads. But it didn't in the ancient Near East, because in the ancient Near East, it was not the older that would serve the younger, but the exact reverse. God is a God who sometimes turns things, as we call it, topsy-turvy or upside down. This is just one of the cases, and hopefully, as we examine this text, your understanding of Jacob will be turned upside down as well. But the contract is there, the promise is that. The promise is that there will be a struggle between Rebekah's descendants. And as you map that out in history from that point on, you find that's exactly what has happened, because among the descendants of Esau are the Arab peoples, and of course the descendants of Jacob are we as Jews. And that struggle has gone on, like I said, throughout history. God says one will be greater than the other. The older will serve the younger. And that's astounding, as I suggested, that the older would serve the younger. But please, at this point in time, notice something very carefully from the text. God is behind this, not Jacob. God is behind this, not Jacob. It's God's selection, not Jacob's seduction. It's a matter of God's will, not Jacob's wiles. On top of the promise, then later on, you have a pronouncement coming from Romans chapter 9 that reinforces this promise. And I'll remind you of that pronouncement, Romans 9, 10 to 13. In those verses, the rabbi Let me back that up a second. You do remember that the person who wrote Romans was a rabbi? Nod your heads, yes. Okay. All right. Then you haven't started sleeping from dinner. The rabbi tells us that the choice of Jacob was a matter of God's choice. He uses terms such as election and purpose. He says this is something that took place before their birth. And then he tells us that this choice is a result of God's compassion. In other words, God's grace, God's love, as he elaborates in verses 12 and 13. And in citing this text, the text is actually a quotation of Malachi chapter 1, verses 2 and 3, which says, where God says, Jacob have I loved, Esau have I hated. But that is the pronouncement that reinforces the promise that God made, that the older will serve the younger. Now, once the contract is in place, we can begin to examine the contrast that you see developing verses 24 to 28. Now, there's a contrast, first of all, in these two boys' names and in the two boys' natures. And we start with their names. The first one to arrive on the scene is called Esau. He's described as someone who is hairy. In other words, when he popped out of his mother's womb, he looked just like me. Full beard, well, not so full head of hair, but yeah. The term Esau may refer to hairy. We're not quite sure what it means, but we do know that names had some sort of implication in those days. Some of the speculation coming from ancient Jewish sources is that he appeared so completely developed. In other words, he was as hairy as an older child might have been. Okay, so maybe that's the reason for his name. And then out comes Jacob. And as he comes out, he's hanging on to his brother's heel. Right? Now, I don't know about you, but take a pause in the story for just a minute. These stories are interesting stories. They become really more interesting if we take some time to reflect on them. So can you imagine, here you are, you and your twin, you've had a delightful 9 months in your mother's cozy womb. It's been a great time to get to know each other. You're playing with each other. It's all kinds of fun. And all of a sudden you see your brother leaving. What are you going to do? Wait a second there. Grab hold. I'm coming with you. And that's basically what happens here. He had his hand on the heel of his brother. Now, as a result of that, if you look at many texts and many teachings, you'll see that that is meant to indicate, or that implies that he's the deceiver, the supplanter, right? Are you awake?
Yes.
Okay. Wrong. But that's the... I drew you into that. That's okay. That description of Jacob does not come from the text. It comes 2 chapters later from Esau's mouth. In other words, that's Esau's opinion. Now, whether or not this is an opinion you want to follow, hold off on that till we look at Esau a little further. But let's be clear from the beginning. That description of Jacob does not come from the text. It comes directly from Esau's mouth. As it turns out, the name Jacob, or Yaakov, means, may he be at your heels. And the he there being referenced to is God. So the name means, may God be at your heels. Or if you would have it, your defending rear guard. Now, why would that be important? In ancient days, as well as in Roman times, when you went out to war, you had armor, head, something on your chest, possibly covering your arms and your legs. But guess where you didn't have armor? Behind you. You know why? These ancient generals were smart. They figured if you didn't have armor back here, what direction are you going to keep going? Yes, you're not going to turn and go the other way. Now that means that whoever was behind you was very important. So when you have a name, may he, God, be your defending rear guard. That is a very strong name. That is a name of great promise. And that, in fact, is what this name means. If you were to look it up simply in the Encyclopedia Judaica, it just says, it translates as God protects. That's close enough. The Hebrew term akev means heel, and Yaakov means may he be at your heel, or your defending rear guard. It's just as simple as that. It's not difficult. Yaakov becomes Yaakov, which becomes Jacob. All right? And we have similar names found from the time of Abraham on with a similar meaning. Now, where do we get this idea of deceiver or supplanter other than from Esau? I'm going to suggest that it's a bias. It's a bias against Jacob because people did not understand God's working or God's word. Remember, God is the one who promised to bless Jacob from the beginning. And his name properly understood is an indicator of this. By the way, that name, or something similar to that name, occurs in another very important text. Isaiah 52, verse 12. Right now, I know it's after dinner, I know it's getting later in the evening, but stick with me in this. Isaiah 52:12 comes right before Isaiah 52:13. Okay, good. You got it. So what? Isaiah 52:13 to 15 is the prologue to Isaiah 53. Isaiah 53 is the classic chapter that describes the one who suffered and died and rose, the text indicates as well, for our sins. It's probably the most classic chapter in the entirety of Scripture describing Jesus' atonement for us. By the way, if I accidentally describe him as Yeshua, please forgive me. That is the name that his mother and father used, even though you may not be familiar with it. It is his Hebrew name. Anyhow, Isaiah 52:12 says, "May the God of Israel," by the way, Israel, the name Israel, you are familiar with the fact that that was Jacob's other name? Okay, good. It says, "May the God of Israel be your guard." In other words, the Hebrew is a play on words. May the God of Israel be your Jacob. Okay, so it's a name of great blessing. And this is not uncommon. In the ancient Near East, names were given which either described a person's character, described a person's appearance, or described the hope for a person, or possibly his stature or authority. So names were important, and so he's given a very important name. Now, a quick note on name changes, as I've already alluded to, an additional name for Jacob. You remember that grandfather Abraham had a name change. He wasn't originally grandfather Abraham, he was Abram, right? Or in Hebrew, Avram. There's a very interesting ancient Jewish reference that reflects on Genesis 17:5, where God says, "Your name will no longer be called Abram." It views it as a negative commandment. In other words, this is how it was, it will no longer be that way. So you can see the negative sense of the commandment. Now, that same text goes on to note that the wording is different when we get to Jacob. When Jacob receives his new name in Genesis 35, God says, here's what the text says, "Your name is, or is still Jacob." This is never said about Abram's old name. And then God also gives him the name of Israel. So Abraham's new name is an upgrade of his former name, rendering the former name obsolete. But not so with Jacob and with Israel. Scripture continues to speak of both Jacob and Israel. But once Abram's name is changed to Abraham, Abram never is used again in Scripture. On the other hand, Jacob retains his perfectly good name. And so it's part of the promise that God gave to Abraham and he repeated to Jacob, "I will make your name great." So there's a contrast in the names of the two boys. There's a contrast also in the nature of the two boys. Esau, we're told, the text tells us, is a skilled hunter. He's a man at home with the outdoors, which is where he ended up spending most of his time. Now the text tells us that Jacob liked to be at home. He liked to be at home, and perhaps here's where he learned about God at his mother's knee. And here at home, in the tents, he listened to the stories his father told about his grandfather Abraham, about his grandfather's faith, and about God's faithfulness. And then our text goes on to say, depending on your translation, describing Jacob, and he was a quiet man, or a peaceful man, some translations have it, or some translations simply have it, a plain man. A quiet man, a peaceful man, a plain man. What is the text trying to tell us here? Well, if you unwrap the text a little bit and take a look at the Hebrew behind it, the Hebrew phrase here describing Jacob is the Hebrew phrase Ish Tam. Ish Tam. It's a term, I don't know if any of you are working from a New American Standard Bible. If you've got a New American Standard version that has a note in the margin, the note in the margin may very well render this Hebrew term properly. It means whole or complete. Ish is a term for man. Tam is the term being referred to, means whole or complete. The text describes him, in other words, as blameless, as perfect. Now Let me repeat that for you because that's what the text says. Describes Jacob as Ish Tam, as perfect or blameless. Now what does that mean? It means that all sides of his personality were developed, in contrast to Esau's almost single-mindedly emphasis on hunting. In other words, Jacob was a man who was concerned about family. He was concerned about God. In contrast with Esau, whose concern was for himself and his own interests, almost solely. Now this term Tam, or its fuller form Tamim, it's not the first time you find this in the biblical text. You find it describing another person. You find it describing Noah in chapter 6 in Genesis. And the term Tamim in regard to Noah is associated with this phrase, and Noah walked with God. So the term is related to walking with God. But the term is also used at the end of the Torah in Deuteronomy chapter 32 and verse 4. It says the rock, talking about God. His work is Tamim. It's perfect. His ways are just, a God of faithfulness and without injustice. Righteous and upright is he. That's what this term is associated with, and you need to begin to understand Jacob in light of how the term is used. The very term that's used to describe him, Ish Tam. Are you with me? More importantly, are you with the text? Now, a number of chapters later, there's an interesting passage that illustrates this highly commended devotion of Jacob's. It's inherent in this phrase, Ish Tam. Genesis 32, verses 2 and 3 says this, and it's part of a later familiar story about Jacob. It says, and Jacob went on his way, and the angels of God met him. And when Jacob saw them, he said, this is God's camp. This is God's camp. Now that's interesting because in our text, Genesis 25, verse 27, it describes Jacob as one who dwells in tents. In other words, as one who was a dweller in tents, he certainly would have been one who would recognize God's camp. Does that make sense? The texts are intentionally intended to be connected. Now, a dweller in tents, what does that mean? What does that phrase mean? Our ancient Jewish teachers, in examining this text, remind us that this is a phrase that's an idiom for a person who's a student in a Torah academy, or what you would call a Bible academy or Bible school. It describes a person who compiles an internal store of knowledge and so develops moral and ethical character. The hunter, on the other hand, is someone who concentrates on what he has. The dweller in tents values what he knows and who he is with respect to God or in relationship to God. An interesting and important description of these two children. Now, in addition, dwelling in tents, as our text says, implies that Jacob was the one who tended the fields and managed the household because he was at home and therefore able to do that. You see, overseeing the household should have been Esau's job as the elder son. But our text already tells us that Esau preferred to go out and to hunt game rather than to stay home and manage the estate, so to speak. So it appears that by his general lifestyle, Esau showed his contempt for his birthright from the very beginning. And this is confirmed later by the statement found in Genesis 25 and verse 34, which you read in our text. So, or therefore, Esau despised his birthright. And so it was from the very beginning. Now, further insight is found in a rabbinic discussion of these texts. After many years of barrenness, and you'll pardon me if I draw on the rabbis, it's sort of inherent within who I am and what I do. But let me take a quick step, not a step back, I'll take a step to the side. A quick step to the side. You are familiar with the fact that the stories we're looking at are Jewish stories, right? Okay, just wanted to make sure we're all on the same page. Now, since they're Jewish stories, as Jews, we have spent an awful lot of time studying them. And I'm going to suggest that having spent a lot of time studying them and teaching them as Jews, some Jews may have gotten some unique insights into these texts, particularly our ancient Jewish teachers, called the sages, who later became known as the rabbis. So if I draw on that source, you'll understand. Okay? All right. Now, back to the story. After many years of barrenness, Rebekah has become pregnant. But as you look at our text, her pregnancy causes her great pain. Verse 22. And the children struggled. We'll look at that text, that verb from the Hebrew in just a minute. The children struggled within her. And so she said, if this be so, why should I live? And she went to inquire of God. And God's response, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples shall be separated from your body. Stop. Now, how does God's answer address Rebekah's condition? How does God's response provide her with any comfort at all? We read the story very quickly and don't pause to think about the human circumstances involved, and you need to raise those kinds of questions. If anything, God is only confirming an ongoing battle between 2 opposing people and powers to whom she's about to give life. That kind of response would not have lessened her anguish, it would have intensified her anguish. So, what's going on in this story? Again, drawing on some of the wisdom of the ancient rabbis, let me suggest the following. One of the rabbinic stories provides us with some rather graphic image to and information regarding Rebekah's discomfort. And it says, the story goes like this. First of all, notice that the Hebrew word that is used here, vayitrotzetsu, usually translated struggle, and I translated it struggle when I read it for you originally, is constructed from the word mitzah, which literally means run. So the term means running rather than struggle. So our ancient sages, our rabbis of old, picture a situation in which Rebekah passes a house of Bible study. And Jacob within her moves to run towards the house of Bible study. But when she passes a house of idolatry, the story goes on, Esau moves aggressively in order to emerge and go to the house of idolatry. And it's on this basis that we have the interpretation that describes Rebekah's dilemma. She thought she was carrying one child, a single child, and therefore she could not understand the jostling going on inside her. One day the child would be lunging towards a house of worship, and the next day the child would be lunging towards a house of idolatry. Can you see her dilemma? All right. In other words, was she about to give birth to a biblical Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde? And if such was the case, she indicates, she doesn't want to live. The heir to the majestic tradition of Abraham, the descendant of the sacred example of Isaac, can hardly be a schizophrenic who doesn't know what he wants or where he belongs. And this is why Rebekah is disturbed by this dilemma. And against this backdrop, God's answer is genuinely consoling. It's not one child of 2 minds, it's 2 children, each with their own mind, 2 different individuals in her womb. And one of them, the younger, is already attracted to God and to the Scriptures. He's the one who's designed to carry on the heritage of Israel. And so this text becomes comforting to her. Now, a number of chapters later, Genesis chapter 28, we have a little more hint coming from the Hebrew text related to Jacob. It's the story of the, and we'll reflect on this a little tomorrow morning as well, so there'll be a little bit of carryover from tonight to tomorrow. Jacob falls asleep, it's the ladder into heaven, and you remember the angels coming down, going up. But the text reads, Malchei Elohim olim veyordim. Now, if that sounds Greek to you, sorry, it happens to be Hebrew, but that's okay. The text doesn't say coming down and going up. It says going up and coming down. In other words, they were originating from Jacob. There's something special about this person, Jacob, that the angels originate from him and go up. And then the text And then God speaks from the top of the ladder, and he talks about Abraham, your father. Why Abraham, your father, instead of Isaac, your father? Because God is making here a very important point. He's saying, Jacob, you're like Abraham. In other words, like father, like son. Now, I understand it's like grandfather, like son, but you understand what's going on here. And the text, God himself is trying to get that across to us. It's hidden in the text, but it's there. But nevertheless, we shouldn't be surprised by this, because remember, our text has already described Jacob as Ish Tam, as perfect or blameless. As we put the descriptions together, the text tells us that God was pleased with Jacob because Jacob had a place for God, had a hunger for his word, had a sense of responsibility towards family. And as we draw in the characteristic from Noah that applies to him as well, he had a walk with God. Why do we translate quiet man or peaceful man or plain man? Perhaps because of a bias against Jacob. The text means something far, far more. Now, at this point in time, it might be well to take another step back, so to speak, and ask ourselves the question, are you one-dimensional like Esau? Are you multi-dimensional like Jacob? But by the way, it's not important just to be merely multi-dimensional. One of those dimensions needs to include room for God. Are you Esau? Are you Jacob? Are you multi-dimensional or one-dimensional? Is there room for God? Are you complete in the sense that Jacob is described? Well, I better stop asking those questions. I'm meddling. Let's get back to the story. All right. We have the contrast now completed. Then we have the conflict in verse 28. That's next. The text says this: Isaac loved Esau. Isaac loved Esau. As you look at the text, it's apparent he liked his success. He had a taste for wild game. In other words, he liked Esau's skill and his strength. On the other hand, our text says that Rebekah loved Jacob. Now, is this a conflict? Well, it does indicate that Esau was Isaac's favorite. Jacob was Rebekah's. Not that either hated the other, but one, well, each of them clearly had a favorite. But let me suggest it goes a little further than that. The text is indicating to us that Rebekah was faithful to God's word. Remember, Jacob was God's intended son of promise. And it appears that Isaac, because of his admiration, as the text indicates, his admiration for Esau, wanted to change God's plan. Now, if you think I'm reading too much into this text, let me remind you, in 2 chapters, or actually a chapter and a half, Isaac does exactly that. He tries to change God's plan by blessing the wrong son. But we're not there yet. We're just concluding Act 1, which is the birth. We now move to Act 2, which is the birthright. Verses 29 to 34. These verses reveal more about the boys. First of all, we see that Esau reflects what we might call a temporal perspective. Verses 29 to 32. He comes in from the hunt. He's famished for food, verse 30 tells us. And he's obsessed by what Jacob is cooking, which is called red stew. And then the biblical text says, and this is really strange coming right here, the biblical text tells us, this is why he was called Edom. E-D-O-M. Edom. And we should be raising the question, just because he asked for red stew once, he's called Edom. Edom, by the way, is a term related to the term bread. Actually, red stew, or more literally translated red stuff, in its construction, the Hebrew construction says this, literally, the red, this red. The red, this red. In other words, it's some kind of special red stuff that the text is indicating for us. And it could quite possibly, and stick with me on this for a minute, or stick with me on this for a minute. It could quite possibly be that Esau thought that what he was seeing was blood soup. Now, blood soup was not usually mentioned by name in the ancient Near East. Now, you might say, wait, slow down. What do you mean, blood soup? In those days, blood was understood to have magical powers. And by the way, remember Esau's avid interest in hunting? Would certainly go hand in hand with that. So his focus on this red stuff, this special red stuff, his focus on perhaps the magical power so blinded his perspective that he ignored an important priority. You see, according to a number of the ancient Jewish sources, the very day that this transaction between Jacob and Esau took place was the same day that Abraham died. Now, according to tradition, acting as the priest of the family, it was the job of the firstborn of the grandchildren, namely Esau, to cook the red cabbage or the lentils and to place it on the grave of the person who had died as a memorial. Now, in this case, the function should have been performed by Esau as the firstborn of the second generation. But where was Esau? He was out hunting once again. You see, lentil stew was a traditional dish made during the time of mourning. And our ancient Jewish teachers tell us that Jacob was cooking the stew for the mourning ceremony of his recently deceased grandfather Abraham. Now, not only was Esau not putting forth any effort in public mourning over the passing of his grandfather, remember he was out hunting, he was not mourning, a link in the generations of blessing. He turns his back on any efforts in his ongoing relationships with the living, namely the mourners. Follow? He's out there hunting, he forgets the dead. He's out there hunting, he's not with the mourners where he's supposed to be, so he has no concern for the living either. In that sense, Esau is very much a dead man, merely filling his gut, perceiving only the physical ache of his stomach and his low blood sugar. Jacob, on the other hand, manifests compassion by making the lentil stew for the mourners that should have been his brother's role, and he does so then as a physical and as a spiritual act. That means here we have Jacob who's tending to this world as well as the world to come through his ability to perform this good deed with a full heart and consistently with the kind of person he is. Remember, Ish Tam, the complete or perfect person, the one who is blameless. So once again, we have Jacob fulfilling a family requirement for his brother. When Esau comes in from the field hungry, and therefore with no apparent desire to fulfill his responsibility, Jacob told Esau to sell him his birthright. In other words, if Jacob had to do what only the firstborn could or should do, then he needed the birthright to officially perform the function. In addition, we're told that this ritual was to be performed while fasting. The ceremony involved fasting. Therefore, if Esau just had to eat, which he's telling us in this text, he was in no way committed to performing this ceremony and to fulfilling his responsibility. And besides, as the text indicates, it appears that he really wanted the powers associated with the soup. And so he tries to play on Jacob's pity. Look at what he says. He says, "Brother, I'm about to die. I'm about to die." And here's Jacob, the cruel, heartless person he is, who wouldn't feed a dying man without getting something in return, taking advantage of his brother when he was down. Right? Isn't that the way the story's told? You know what my answer is. Wrong. How long does it take to die from hunger? Remember Esau? What was he noted as? A successful hunter? He had dinner on his back, waiting to be cooked. All right? What the text is telling us is he wanted the magic more than what mattered. He wanted the red stuff more than the birthright. And so you have the biblical emphasis in the text, very clear. This is why he's called Edom, or red. Because his obsession tells us something about his focus, his concern, his values. Now, on the other hand, as this part of the text tells us, Jacob reflects true priorities. In other words, he properly valued the prize. You see, the birthright was more than just the inheritance rights of the firstborn. It was more than that. The birthright is what gave the person the privilege of acting as priest in the family. In other words, as priest representing God to the family, and as priest bringing the concerns of the family to God. That was part of the birthright. And this Jacob considered a real prize. That's why he's called Ishtam. And therefore Jacob had the persistence to pursue the prize. You see, Jacob desired what Esau disdained, the privilege of standing before God on behalf of his family. And so, as the text indicates, he asked for it not once but twice. And that in itself tells us how important this was for him. And I want you to notice something else from our text. There is no deception involved. There is no deception involved. It's open, upfront bargaining. It is fair and square. Each son got what he wanted according to his own priorities. For Jacob, the godly was more important than the goodies. However, verse 34 here, the text says Esau despised his birthright. The privilege of standing before God was of no value to him. Now, prior to the night of deception in Genesis 27, we learn two things about Esau. We learn here that he despises his birthright. We also learn it in the next chapter, chapter 26, toward the end, that he marries two Hittite women. Now again, that tends to go right past most people. But if you've been reading the story thus far, since we read through this in the synagogue every year, we've already read the text from, a couple or three chapters earlier, where Abraham buries his wife Sarah. And he makes a very important point of trying to keep her and himself distinct from the surrounding peoples with whom he had good relationships. Those surrounding peoples were Hittites. Jacob understood the importance of making a distinction. Esau doesn't get it at all. And he marries not one, but two Hittite wives. Undoubtedly, what the text is telling us in its context is Esau is morally crippled. The greatest deception then would be, let me submit, would be his being rewarded with the birthright, with Esau becoming the heir to Abraham and Isaac, with him becoming the standard bearer of God's new move among them in the history of his world, as he brings into his world what has been called ethical monotheism, a belief in one God with the ethics that are associated with it. In fact, Esau traded all of that, I was going to say for a bowl of soup. It was a little more than a bowl, but you understand the imagery. For a bowl of soup and two Hittite wives, he thought that was worth more. His having received the birthright would have created, let me suggest, an eternal lie, the consummate deception. And it would, in every likelihood, would have aborted the unique promise of the nation of Israel that God had made. And please note in our text that Isaac is blind to this fundamental truth. And I say that with both meanings of the term. He was blind to this truth. So there's a principle that we find here. The principle is elaborated for us in the commentary found in Hebrews chapter 12. And there Hebrews chapter 12 simply describes Esau as godless. That's pretty straightforward and frank. Godless. As someone who despised, who discarded, who sold out his birthright for a single meal. He had a concern for magical powers, but he had no concerns for the rights or the responsibilities of the firstborn, nor for the relationship before God that all that represented. In other words, he was godless because he left God out. For him, the temporal was more important than the eternal. For him, the present was more important than the permanent. Standing in contrast to Esau the godless is Jacob, Ishtam, the perfect, complete person. And that's how the text sets it up for us. Let me meddle for just a second again. Which one of the two reflects you? And that has to do with what are your priorities, your concerns, your obsessions. But enough meddling. Act 3. I told you this act is not the blessing, but the blessings. Because it's not just chapter 27, it's also chapter 28, but we'll get to it in time. In the opening paragraph of chapter 27, there's a predicament that unfolds. Isaac had apparently convinced himself that Esau was the man of God's choice, despite the clear expression of God's will before their birth. What did God say before their birth? Jacob, the younger. Isaac was blind to this. So it's not surprising that the text also describes him as being physically blind. He was going to pass on to Esau the blessing that belonged to Jacob. And notice, Esau's not about to protest. You don't see verse 27, verse 1.5, that says, Esau stood up and told his father, Papa, I sold the birthright to Jacob. It's not found in my translation. I doubt if it's found in yours either. Isaac is going to pass on the blessing that belonged to Jacob. Esau is not about to protest. God's purpose was about to be sidetracked. When Rebekah learns of this, what should she do? Well, in the next paragraph, she makes a proposal, and she explains her plan to Jacob in verses 5 to 10. But in verses 11 to 13, Jacob raises a question. Now, as he raises this question in verses 11 and 12, what's Jacob saying? It's okay to deceive so long as I don't get caught. Verse 12, the term deceiver is used, but the term in Hebrew literally means mocker. And again, if you've got a New American Standard Bible, which often provides a more literal translation in the margin, you'll see that. Mocker. In other words, Jacob knew that the blessing was rightfully his. He realized that he should take steps to secure it. But if Isaac discovered what was going on, he would consider it a mockery of a sacred task he wanted to perform. Jacob says, I don't want to mock my father. Jacob did not want to denigrate or mock Isaac in this way. And so he raises the question. In verse 13, nevertheless, we're told he obeys his mother. His mother, who was committed to seeing God's purpose accomplished, even at great cost. And by the way, it cost her the presence of her son for the rest of her life. But she was willing to go that far. Remember, Esau had legally sold these rights, the rights to these blessings, to Jacob earlier in the text. We just looked at them. And apparently Esau had never bothered to inform Isaac that the transaction had occurred. So a greater deception was that Esau, who now had absolutely no rights to the blessings, was going to pretend that he deserved them and that he was the rightful heir to the blessings. But remember, the text tells us Jacob had properly acquired these rights, and under Rebekah's inspiration was now fighting for what was his and what God had promised should be his. By the way, had Esau received Isaac's blessings, the covenant promises of Abraham, his grandfather, would undoubtedly not have been passed on to the next generation. Certainly not through Hittite wives. And Isaac was apparently oblivious to this. Now, Rebekah, being wiser than her husband, understood the essence of what was going on and understood what needed to characterize the son of blessing. And she also remembered how Jacob, even while in the womb, indicated what his inclination was, an inclination towards God. Now, Rebekah never sets out to deceive Isaac. Hear me carefully. She merely wants to prove to him that Jacob has enough of the external virtues of Esau to carry on the heritage correctly. And he certainly had the internal character that Esau was so greatly lacking, but had managed to hide from his father. Let me unwrap that as we go on. There's a commentary on this text, an ancient Jewish commentary on the text, that is very insightful at this point. It tells us that Jacob came close to Isaac, and as he came to Isaac, he came with his head bowed and in tears. So unhappy was he that he had become in this way, even though it was to gain what was truly his and what God had promised to him. And if you look at the text carefully, it's interesting that even when he was forced to fool Isaac, Jacob still tried to stay as close to the truth as possible. And so he uses ambiguous language in going through this process so as to avoid lying directly to his father. Falsehood was so repulsive to Jacob that even when he had to lie, he tried to stay as close to the truth as possible. Remember what we are told about Jacob as we began this little story? Micah chapter 7, verse 20. Jacob is noted for emet, for truth, or for truthfulness. And the text indicates this as you read carefully. Now, sometimes the translations won't allow you to get to what's going on as clearly, but the Hebrew certainly supports what I'm about to share with you. Verse 19, in answer to the question, Jacob says, "It is I, Anuki, Esau, your firstborn." Next phrase. That can be translated correctly in Hebrew. It is I, namely it is I who's bringing this to you. Esau is your firstborn. In other words, he says, Esau is your firstborn. With me? Okay. Others suggest, in answer to the question, Jacob simply said, "It's I." And then more loudly said, "Esau is your firstborn." And then the text goes on to say, and this is a critical passage here, and this again is another one of those texts that's missed because it's read through too swiftly, or read through because of the way in which we've been told to read this through. It says, "I have done as you told me. I have done as you told me." That's exactly what characterized Jacob's life, if you read the text. He was saying, "I have done on many and repeated occasions, as in fact you have told me. I have followed your example and the example of our father Abraham." He had walked with God. He was Ishtan. And that description of Jacob is the text description of Jacob, in contrast to Esau's continual misbehavior. Let's put it that way. Well, on to the play that they put on, verses 14 to 40. Now, the text in verse 33 is highly significant here. The text in verse 33 of chapter 27 notes this: Isaac trembled a great trembling. Isaac trembled a great trembling. And he said, "Who then is he that has taken venison and brought it to me? And I have eaten of it all before you came, and I have blessed him." Interesting question, but it's his next phrase. It's absolutely amazing. "Moreover, he shall be blessed." All right, now look. Jacob had entered his father's tent in goat skins and in Esau's clothes, pretending to be Esau in order to get his father to give him the blessing Isaac wanted to give to Esau. When Isaac discovers Jacob's deception, we would expect an angry reaction. It would certainly seem that any reaction would have been justified if Isaac had turned the blessings into curses, as Jacob thought might happen. As he said, "Perhaps my father will feel me, and I shall seem to be to him a mocker, and I shall bring a curse upon me and not a blessing." Now look, from our perspective, Jacob's anticipated punishment is justified. But the exact opposite occurs. At the very moment of discovery, here's what Isaac declares: "Moreover, he, Jacob, shall be blessed." Blessed after this deception? Come on, give me a break. But if we're going to speak about real deception, we have to start at the beginning. Even before any of the entanglements between Jacob and Esau unfold, remember that the Torah, the text of Scripture, has already clearly defined the vast difference between these two brothers. Remember the text? "And the boys grew, and Esau was a cunning hunter, a man of the field, and Jacob was a simple man, dwelling in tents." The Hebrew here in 25:27 suggests that Esau knew how to entrap or deceive. And picking up on this, an ancient Jewish commentary looks at the phrase that's used here. The Hebrew phrase is Yodea Tzayid, knowing how to hunt, and suggests that Esau had also developed the skill of verbal entrapment. In other words, tricking his father into thinking that he was extremely diligent in keeping his father's guidelines, God's guidelines. So it is hardly surprising for us then, as we move on through this verse, that we find that that Isaac loved Esau, and the text says because the hunt or the entrapment was in his mouth. Said the fifth. In other words, this is an ambiguous phrasing here. The hunt was in his mouth, or the entrapment was in his mouth. Either in Isaac's mouth or Esau's mouth. If it's Isaac's mouth, it refers to the end result of the entrapment, the venison. If it refers to Esau's mouth, then it's his skill at being one who can entrap and deceive others. It refers to his deceitfulness and his dishonest tongue. Let me suggest Hebrew operating the way it often does, and the Jewish text operating the way they often do. Both are suggested, because the one becomes a picture of the other. Genesis 25:28. It seems the Bible is suggesting that Isaac was fooled by the child who said the right things at the right time. But Rebekah, she sees the world and Esau with different eyes. First of all, God himself had told her 2 nations were in her womb, and that the elder would serve the younger. And even more to the point, she grew up with Laban the Aramean, her brother, a word that is linguistically connected with the Hebrew word Rama'i, which means deceiver. And his name, Laban, and the description, the Aramean, occurs 3 times in our portion, for no particular reason, because he's not a character here, but he's referenced here, suggesting to us that Rebekah knew only too well the sounds of a person who spoke out of both sides of his mouth, the deceiver. Therefore, Rebekah sees an opportunity to demonstrate Esau's true character. Look, she can't confront this directly because Rebekah can't criticize Esau outright. He's Isaac's favorite. And so the great matriarch must therefore demonstrate to her naive husband that he is capable of being tricked, and that he has therefore misjudged his sons all these years. And so she sets up a situation, and this is classic, in which Jacob assumes the outward, the superficial trappings which so eagerly attracted Isaac, the ruggedness, the smell, the meat, and therefore demonstrates to Isaac that what he prized in Esau was purely surface and had no depth of character or lasting inner spiritual significance. That was reflected for us, as the text indicates, by Jacob. Would she ever have answered Jacob's fear of being cursed by saying, "Well, maybe your curse," had she not understood Isaac's heart perfectly? Had she not known that as soon as Isaac realized that he was capable of being deceived, he would also understand that in fact that same deception had been practiced by Esau all these years. And that is precisely what happens in our story. Esau's arrival with the meat produces great trembling in Isaac, possibly even evoking the trembling that Isaac himself felt on the altar under Abraham's knife. And he realizes that just as his own father once nearly sacrificed him, he had unconsciously been sacrificing his own son Jacob, overlooking the son given over to study and responsibility, to morality and following God, in favor of the son who craved animal blood. Once again, there's an interesting ancient Jewish interpretation of this particular scene. And we're told this, that Isaac trembled because he saw hell open up beneath Esau. As the text says, whereas Gan Eden, that's the Hebrew phrase for paradise, entered along with Jacob, Gehinnom, the term for hell, opened up beneath Esau. That's an amazing picture, but a good understanding of the text. It is teaching us that Isaac trembled at this point more than he trembled when he was about to be sacrificed by Abraham. You see, all of his life, Isaac thought that Esau was the one who was the righteous individual, that Esau, not Jacob, was the one who deserved the blessings. Hell opening up beneath Esau showed Isaac the terrible mistake he had been living with. All of his life he'd been wrong about his sons. And so we read, as the text says in Genesis 27:33, his whole body began to tremble with a great trembling. There's a further insight that's supplied to us by the Jewish commentary. Isaac trembled. In other words, Isaac perceived hell open up beneath Esau, which was in sharp contrast, the commentary says, to the fragrance of Eden. Not now just the image of the Garden of Eden, but the fragrance of Eden that accompanied Jacob into Isaac's chamber. The presence of hell along with Esau made Isaac realize he'd been deceived all along, and that this is the son who is characterized by what characterizes hell. Namely, the son was truly evil. But what is this business about the fragrance of Eden? Because remember, the text here in Genesis 27 talks about the fragrance of the clothes that Jacob was wearing, which means you should ask yourself the question, what clothes was he wearing? And what kind of fragrance would that be? I'm not sure fragrance would be the term I would use to describe it. We're talking about the pungent smell of washed goat skin. That's pretty offensive. We're talking about the smell of freshly slaughtered animal. That's not particularly attractive. I wouldn't use that for perfume. The fragrance of his garments. In other words, there was something that happened when Jacob walked in, and the text sort of hints at, that was so fragrant that it attracted Isaac. And when Isaac realized later what he had just about done, the text tells us that he trembled. Perhaps he was beginning to understand that Jacob was Ishtam. And perhaps he trembled also because he undoubtedly now realized how very close he had come to doing the wrong thing. How very close he had come to violating the express plans and purpose of God himself to bless Jacob. Rebekah, the sister of Laban, the Aramean deceiver, saw it all along. And now Isaac realizes at last that he's capable of being fooled. Anger directed at Jacob is not appropriate. On the contrary, Jacob is the true heir to blessing, which is why the key phrase in our text again, verse 33 of chapter 27 is, moreover, furthermore. Make sure you get the point. He shall be blessed. You see, Jacob, the text is telling us, is not the deceiver. Esau is and has been all along. Now, we look again at the problem. We re-examine the text. And when we re-examine the text of Scripture, what can we observe? Is the problem here Jacob for deceiving Isaac and stealing what was rightfully Esau's? A resounding no. It was rightfully his by the Lord's promise and by a legitimate purchase. Is the problem Rebekah for encouraging Jacob to lie and disregard her husband? Again, no. She was committed to God's purpose and God's promise in contrast to Isaac's plan. And she wanted to reveal to Isaac the true nature of Esau and to reveal to Isaac his deception as the real deception. Is the problem Isaac? Well, consider that with me for a second. He disregarded God's expressly stated choice. He was blind to God's purpose. And his own physical blindness just reinforces that. He sought to circumvent God's directions because he thought he knew better. Friends, that's a lack of faith. Friends, that's disobedience. Friends, that in itself is deception, self-deception. Is the problem Esau? He despised his birthright, we're told. He wanted power, the magic. And in doing so, he was anti-God and anti-biblical. He ignored God. He focused on the temporal. That's why he's called godless. He wanted a blessing. Let's change that. He wanted at least the financial part of the blessing that was not his, it was Jacob's. So he was greedy. In contrast to this, Rebekah and Jacob accepted God's will. They were committed to it. In fact, Rebekah was so committed she was willing to pay the price to see it accomplished. And I'll raise the very thorny question for you at this point, for all of us. What price are you willing to pay to make sure God's purpose in your life and in the lives around you gets accomplished? Are you willing to be a Rebekah and a Jacob? Well, I keep meddling, so I should get back to the story. And I want you to notice something else very important about the text as it unfolds. Genesis chapter 28, the ladder in the heaven text, where God now speaks to Jacob for the first time after this. God never rebuked Rebekah. God never rebuked Jacob. He only pronounced further blessing in Genesis 28, 12 and 15. And then he did it all over again in Genesis chapter 35, verses 10 to 13. I'll repeat it again. God never rebuked Rebekah. God never rebuked Jacob. I would not want to get in the way of God or to stand in the place where only he should stand. Isaac, by the way, finally understood what Rebekah had been trying to tell him all along. The blessing belongs to Jacob. Jacob was the son, true to God, each time. So Isaac never rebuked Rebekah. Isaac never rebuked Jacob. In fact, in chapter 28, Isaac blesses Jacob again. That's why this last act is called the blessings, plural. He blessed Jacob twice, just like God blessed Jacob twice. Now, unfortunately, when this tale of the two brothers is told, Jacob usually gets a raw deal. Yet actually, he's a good role model. Not without flaws, but a good role model. And we should reclaim him. The contrast he presents to Esau teaches us about proper priorities and perspectives. But what do we usually hear about this story? The gross mishandling and misunderstanding. One of my former students, and even though he's a former student, he still remains a friend, and sometimes that doesn't always take place. But nevertheless, he heard a radio broadcast, a religious radio broadcast, in which a very well-known teacher was talking about selfish Jacob. And he actually described, I'm now reading from an email he sent me, and he actually described Esau with the adjective grace. And then my student raises a question, as he rightfully should have, or I would have changed his grade. Has he never read Malachi 1, 2 to 3, or Romans 9, 13, or by the way, Genesis 25 through 27? Now, had I had it in my power to raise his grade, having already submitted it months before, I would have done that because he got it right. In stark contrast, the ancient Jewish interpretations call Jacob as the most special of the patriarchs. Why does he, more than Abraham and Isaac, merit this unique description, which is hinted at in our text? It is Jacob who has the great distinction of parenting the 12 tribes. And it's after his name, Israel, that the Jewish people, as well as the Jewish homeland, the nation of Israel, and the land of Israel are all named. In other words, he's truly blessed by God. And the interpreters got that correctly as they read these texts. His name, as was promised, has become great. Jacob was blessed by God. I lied to you not twice, but 3 times. First time before he was even born, in Genesis 25. And then again in chapters 28 and 35, which I referred to. And so later, when in anger, Esau pursued him. Jacob, the one who had wrestled the angel of the Lord to a standstill all night long, that Jacob did not fight. Though he had an army that could have withstood Esau, Jacob put down all arms, and he sent gifts of reconciliation to his brother instead, so that he would not kill his brother in battle. You see, Jacob is not a weak, cowering trickster, as he's often portrayed. He's a man who knew how to hold on to God and to prevail. He's no greedy shyster, as he's described in many cases. He obtained everything he had through years and years of hard work. Besides, the thing that Jacob wanted most was what Esau valued least: the standing, the covenant relationship with the Almighty God. That's why he's called Ishtam. What do we value most is the question that the text raises for us. Jacob, he's Ishtam, the complete person, the one who walked with God. And friends, that's the Bible's estimate. The deceiver is Esau's estimate. Is Esau a good character reference? I suggest not. Ishtam, Jacob, complete, blameless, a concern for family and for God, a one who pleased God and walked with God, a great example, and most appropriate then to be the father of the 12 tribes and the heir of Abraham. Oh, and by the way, he understood what happened in his life. Remember, the younger will serve the older. When Joseph brought Jacob's 2 grandsons to be blessed by Jacob at the end of Genesis 49, he switches his hands and gives the greater blessing to who? The younger. He understood the lessons. Esau, person concerned with the temple, with the present, with the impermanent, with power, with status. Person concerned with himself. Jacob, one fully committed to God, walking with God. The one who had his priorities correct, who had his focus in the right place, whose obsession was stuff related to God, who thought the blessing was important to have. We have blessings too, my friends. Blessings of a relationship with God. Do we share that with others? We have a responsibility before God to walk closely with Him. It's a special privilege and blessing. Do we enter into that? In other words, my final question to you, before you get to pepper me with all kinds of questions, my final question to you tonight: are you Esau or are you Jacob? The choice is yours. Now, somebody inform me as to how we handle the question and answer session.